Hello, for this video I'm just doing a solo one, and today I'm going to be ranting about Ruin of Kings. If you haven't yet, hit that bell and subscribe. I understand that when you're reading a story, even if there is a framing narrative inside of it, that you have to make allowances for the fact that, yes, we are actually here to read a novel, and therefore you do have to accept the fact that a lot of what the characters write and remember is going to be a lot more detailed and in-depth and adding a lot more like personal feelings and stuff than what would normally be in something that people were actually writing. And that's probably why I got as far into the book as I did. However, it starts with this little framing narrative of the demon telling the guy to tell his story, and then the person starts. And from then on, we just kind of have this pretty typical first-person narrator, and then occasionally the scribe will put in like a footnote. And these are like pretty sparse and in between, and usually they add some detail about the world. Like the main character will say something about the world, and then the scribe is all like, actually this isn't technically accurate, but it is what people are taught, which is why I guess he said it. And the issue is, instead of bringing me more into the world, essentially what these footnotes did for me is they reminded me about the framing narrative, but not in a good way. It wasn't in an immersive way. All it does for me is like remind me about this hypothetical framing narrative. And when you're reminded about the framing narrative in a way that just takes you out of the story, it's not serving its purpose. The scribe did not have a really distinctive voice that came out anywhere other than the very sparse footnotes. I'm sure that eventually at the end it all comes together in this interesting thing, but I didn't get there because I was bored. So then the second framing narrative I'll talk about is the main one, which is that the main character is supposed to be telling this story. And I'm like, and you could have just started from first person limited perspective and not have done this framing narrative at all, because as it is, the framing narrative isn't interesting. The main character does not have enough of a distinctive voice to make him an interesting, first of all, just as a first-person protagonist, and secondly, as someone who is hypothetically telling his own story. He is swept up in a situation and an adventure that is beyond his control, which is pretty common in lots of typical fantasy things. And I think if I had known that's what this was going to be, is, oh, long lost prince doesn't want to be prince, I think I would have been more okay with it. But as it was, the fact that he is telling his story, I was expecting him to have a stronger voice, and he just doesn't have one. It's a shame, because for what he is, he should be more interesting than he is. He's like this long lost prince or whatever, who's also raised as a musician's son, but he's also like a thief for this super secret group or whatever. There's so many options and ways to make him an actually interesting character, and instead he just kind of feels like one of those generic fantasy protagonists where it's like you want him to be a cool rogue character, but you're not actually willing to have him do anything bad or mean. The issue isn't that he's not the hero, because that is part of the premise of the book. The part is that the main thing that made me interested in reading this is that he is supposed to be telling his story from jail, and that premise promises something in the way of personal engagement and narration, and that this narrator is going to be interesting, and he's not. And if he gets interesting after I stopped reading, or only by the end of the story, in which it's revealed in this clever twist that, ooh, he's been lying to us, like, I bet that's what's happening, is that, oh, he's leaving things out, and like he's already been leaving things out a little bit. It's like I'm sure that it all comes together into something interesting, but it doesn't matter because I'm not interested now. And so now this was the big reason why I stopped reading the book. It felt like a creative epic fantasy world, but it wasn't as creative as it was promising me. If I had come into this expecting a more generic story, I think I would have been pleasantly surprised. As it was, since like the whole thing seems to be revolving around this twisting of tropes about who is the hero and this narration, it didn't do it for me, because it doesn't really, I don't get as invested in the world. The main character doesn't seem to be active enough. And again, it's not that the main character isn't active, because again, that's not necessarily inappropriate considering he's not really the hero in this case, but it's more like he does not have enough of a distinctive voice to carry the story. And now, here's the saving grace, or what could have been the saving grace, is that he's not the main narrator, because we've got this other narrator. And the other narrator is this demon who is his jailer, who has also apparently eaten other members of his family and friends and absorbed their memories and stuff. First of all, I love this idea because I'm like, ooh, hearing this story told by this demon who's like thousands of years old or whatever and has a completely alien grasp of morality and loves the main character because he's like eating all these people who love the main character but also is willing to eat him too, and just has like a different view of things. How is this person going to tell? It's just a third person, vaguely omniscient story. All these interesting concepts that are not used in interesting ways because the only reason these interesting concepts were come up with was to justify a completely boring, typical telling of the story. It feels like all of these cool things demons can do was literally invented just to justify this demon being able to tell a very boring third person story. And like there's like occasional points where the demon will be like, this person felt scared, and then the demon would be like, oh yes, I ate this person too, haha, that's why I knew they were scared, you didn't know that, but I did. And then they immediately slip out. And those little asides, again, they do exactly the same thing for me as the scribe's footnotes. They bring me out of the story instead of deeper into it, because instead of helping me view things that feel more in the world or see things through a character's unique perspective, it's more of just like waving its hand and saying, hey, remember this cool framing narrative? Yeah, that still exists, and then ducking out of the way. I haven't talked about the plot at all, really, or any of the characterizations, because they don't matter to me, because that's not actually why I picked up the book. I think that, you know, in terms of like plots, I'm actually down for like a lot of the themes of this story. And like, again, I do like things of, you know, long lost prince characters who are kind of like thieves, and he's trying to like escape this other guy who's stalking him, who's like this super evil wizard dude, and the magic is interesting. Like there's lots of good elements, but that's not what I was actually interested in the story for. And maybe that's just me. I'm sure that there's other people who got interested in the story because of other things, but for me, because I wanted this story based on its framing narrative, the lack of how they used it just really disappointed me, and it made me not really trust that the author was going to pull it off in a way that was interesting. If it had just not had any of these framing narratives and it was just kind of presented as a more typical fantasy story, I think I would have been pleasantly surprised by the ways they twist the genre, because there are interesting stuff there. As it was, I was just kind of super annoyed by the absolutely ineffective use of these three framing narratives that could have been really interesting. And I'm not willing to like slog through this book to get a payoff. For a book to be good, its premise has to start paying you back at the beginning. Like a book cannot be only entertaining once all the threads come together. It has to be entertaining all the way. And an interesting premise and narrator is a perfect way to make that happen. Having a super interesting framing narrative, an in-world book, a main character telling a story, really focusing on that and giving all these characters more distinct voices would have done a lot in making me a lot more interested in this book. As it is, they just kind of kept pulling me out of it because I was like, oh, that's right, there's this framing narrative for this that I'm also supposed to be paying attention to, and it just isn't working. I just have to say, if you do want to read a book that involves a demonic or otherworldly ancient entity who talks a lot and has a really funny and unique voice, and also makes use of copious footnotes to give you extra information on the world, and has an entertaining narration, and in which the book also does switch between a couple different protagonists and occasionally gives you narrations from other people's point of views, might I recommend Jonathan Stroud's Amulet of Samarkand. No, this isn't like anything that I'm being like paid to say. It's a legitimately good book. And when I want to read a story about a sassy demon protagonist who occasionally eats people and also, you know, has a really interesting and slightly warped view of the world based on its own experience not being human, this is the book I'm going to read. Those are my thoughts on Ruin of Kings. I'm sure it's actually a great book. I just got bored with it. So hey, like and subscribe, or comment and tell me why I'm super wrong and too lazy and need to finish this book. I'm not gonna, but you can like try to convince me.